This week, we're dealing with two of the major areas of visual storytelling, Chapter 8 with movies and Chapter 9 with television that we do next as we look at the impact of those as part of the mass media in society. In Chapter 8, bit of history of the movie industry, a little bit of talking about movies and culture, thinking about some of the issues and trends, and as part of that, the influence of new technology, including trying to think about 3D and is there anything wrong with 3D? It had its time period in many years past, made a resurgence in the last decade, and then now maybe seems to be a little bit on the decline. In terms of the movie technology, the chapter asks, will 3D technology affect the future of filmmaking? What it doesn't address is what we might go to next in terms of some immersive narratives, and that's in the category of things like virtual reality, augmented reality, and mixed reality. So they may be more important than just the basic sense of what we have currently with 3D movie making. So, what about the movie history? Well, Hollywood became the center of film production by 1915. We recognize D.W. Griffith as perfecting the techniques during these early years of what is called the silent era, such things as parallel editing, panning, tracking shots, continuity editing, and various other things that we now know as part of regular visual storytelling. Also, through those years, things developed like the Motion Picture Association of America that originally formed in 1922. That happened in part because of efforts by people to push back on some of the content that they were concerned about in movies and some efforts for some censorship or regulation. And the MPAA was able to establish a code of self-censorship that predated our modern rating system. Public attitude has always been divided about film stars and the film industry was in the early days as it is in current times. And so part of understanding the film industry is thinking about that area of media effects that we've tried to address previously. Content in movies early on started becoming a bit of concern. And these days we think about things like glorification of violence, relaxed attitudes about sexual behaviors, positive portrayal of drug use, sexist or racist messages, portrayals of people in a bad light, a lot of things that might be considered to be social concerns about media effects. Well, the original movies obviously were silent, but by 1930, films with sound fully replaced those silent films. By the end of the 1940s, color films largely replaced the original black and white movies. And we go back and look at the success of color with movies like Gone with the Wind and The Wizard of Oz and some early animated films. The studio system is also a part of the history, and the Hollywood studios were vertically integrated, controlling everything in the process, including production, release, distribution, and the viewing. And so the studio system was the way that it operated up until the US v. Paramount case, 1948, brought an end to that total control and required more of a competitive environment for the way movies are made. So the golden age, we go back and look at something like Citizen Kane in 1941 as an example of that high profile artistic movie making. It's not necessarily an exciting movie to watch today, but it was groundbreaking at its time in 1941. The late 1930s to the early 1940s, an important time period. Citizen Kane pioneered techniques and realism, social critique. The biopic, as we mentioned before, loosely based on William Randolph Hearst. 1953 is when the movie industry started reacting to television, and the widescreen image came about as a result of that. And television's picture at that time, up until just recent years, was a 4:3 aspect ratio, and that's the width to the height of the screen. And so Hollywood movie making moved to a widescreen to give them a unique, separate appeal. Also, there's that recognition looking historically at of the blacklist period, and this is a period post-World War II when there suddenly was an investigation into supposed communists in the movie industry. More than 100 people in the movie business were called to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee. This was the height of the Cold War against Russia, and there was a fear of communism threatening the U.S., and that trickled over into the movie industry and caused some people to be identified as communist and blacklisted, meaning they couldn't get jobs. In the 1970s, there became more depiction of sex and violence in movies and became more accepted that it was allowed. We started getting into more blockbusters, things that were knockoffs of other productions and more sequels. And the serialized story is not necessarily a new thing of the 70s, but it became more accepted to have sequels and to be able to make money from those sequels. We got into more technically spectacular things, and blockbusters became part of the kind of the business of movie making. And you can kind of look at maybe the original Star Wars movie as one of those kicking off points for the technically spectacular things in a huge blockbuster style of movie. But of course, the big movie studios will put money into those big blockbusters, but independent films from small studios and small budgets also started having an impact. So, do movies mirror our culture or do they affect our culture? We can look at the development of something like Birth of a Nation in 1915 and the controversy involved in that now, looking back at it. Of course, people recognized it then, but the society was much different and it was more accepted by some people. We can look back at patriotic films and the support of the war effort in the World War II era. We can recognize the impact of a movie like Bonnie and Clyde in 1967 that took criminals and sensationalized them and kind of gave them a high profile and made them into maybe sympathetic characters, even though they were robbers and murderers. We can look back and think about the Hays Code that was in place until 1967 that had strict enforcement limits on content in movies. And then we can look at the MPAA ratings in 1968 changes that started in some ways reducing some of the controls on movie content in terms of just giving it a rating and classifying it. So in terms of movies shaping our culture, we can think about how films may play a key role in development of tastes, desires, customs. People may see things in movies and want to copy them and feel like they're normal and natural. And so we can think about like American myths and traditions and Westerns, the heroes, the anti-heroes in the storyline, and the social issues of how they're portrayed in film. We also then, of course, recognize the Hollywood studios that have been called the Big Six that control huge amount of the movie business. And with that, the blockbusters that have huge production and marketing costs. But then at the same time, we can realize things like Pulp Fiction in 1994 as an independent film also have made their mark in the industry. So the Big Six were 20th Century Fox, Warner Brothers, Paramount Pictures, Columbia Pictures, Universal, and Walt Disney Pictures. Of these, 20th Century Fox, Warner Brothers, and Paramount were part of the original Big Five operating during the golden age of Hollywood. But that has changed a bit recently because Disney acquired a lot of Fox, including the studio, and the speculation at that time as it was getting into this new business model is that the company would likely scale back the Fox studio as the former CEO, Robert Iger, focused on making Disney into a direct consumer digital powerhouse. And of course, we now have Disney Plus as one example of that. But also, we know right now COVID-19 has had a serious financial impact on the movie industry, including Disney. So look at the idea of 3D Avatar in 2009, $190 million to make, $150 million to market that. And today's average Hollywood production budget comes out to about $65 million. That doesn't even include distribution and marketing, which can add about another $35 million, about $100 million to produce and market a movie. And you have to think about the challenge of doing that. The assumption is that the major studios are making heavy profits. But with movie making today so much riskier and so many movies being released, it's really less profitable than it was in that studio system era. And ultimately, about 7 out of 10 movies actually lose money. Could you put up $100 million to make a movie? Well, most of us can't. And so the blockbusters make huge profits and offset those losses from the other movies. What about the impact of technology? Well, TV versus the movies was a big deal in the 1950s. The VCR became popular by the mid 80s and had an impact on movies in terms of people watching things on a VCR, but also the idea of the rental market taking off. VCR technology gave way to the DVT technology, and our chapter talks about the peak of that and the decline. And of course, now we have things that are streaming services like Netflix. We have things like Redbox for movie rentals, but still we have an issue about the access to movies through that and price issues. We have things that are called over-the-top services, and so more and more of those are developing. And that's as simple as Netflix and Hulu, but a lot of the other things that are now coming out that will continue to draw the attention of people as their way of getting movie content. So in the technology area also, the industry has mostly gone digital. There's no film reloading at a movie theater. We project them digitally. The editing process is no longer a mechanical thing that it was in the film days. 3D in the last decade made a resurgence with Avatar, Alice in Wonderland, Gravity, that were big hits in 3D. James Cameron found a way to revolutionize the use of 3D, kicking off this decade full of films attempting to duplicate that sort of quality. If you were to do a search for the best of the last 10 years, you'd find things like Alita Battle Angel from 2019, Despicable Me 2, and Gravity from 2013 as some of the examples that that the evaluation would say make for good use of the 3D technology. What about movie criticism? Well, the changing role amid the internet and blogs. We have fewer professional critics now. People like Siskel and Ebert used to do movie review shows. Those people have both died. But with their demise also is the demise of that kind of way of us learning about movies, where we got Roger Ebert doing the movie review show and then transitioning that to the web. And those things are mostly now internet-based. We have things like Rotten Tomatoes and the Internet Movie Database. We have aggregators and databases that we use for getting information about whether or not a movie is good or not and getting the reviews from that. So with that, let's do a bit of review of some of the major things from this chapter. The first devices to create moving images were which ones? The one by Thomas Edison, the one by the Lumiere brothers. So that was the kinetoscope and the cinematograph. The early technical innovations allowed filmmakers like Witch Parisian film owner to experiment with special effects that produced seemingly magical transformations on screen, like flowers turned into women. So that was Georges Méliès, who played a bit with the technical process of early film. What Edwin S. Porter movie established the realistic narrative as a standard in cinema and was also the first major box office hit of the time, and that is The Great Train Robbery, a short film, but something that's significant historically. In the early years, theaters were still running single reel films, but came in at a standard length of 1,000 feet. That allowed for about how long of a movie? It was one that was about 16 minutes maximum playing time. As movies started becoming multiple reel films, they started then being called features. In the early days of trying to decide where to make movies, Hollywood proved to be an ideal location. For what kinds of reasons? Why did that end up becoming kind of the headquarters of the movie industry? Well, things like the weather in that area. The land at that time was plentiful and cheap, and around the general area, there's quite a bit of a variety of topographic locations for shooting. D.W. Griffith's experiments with shots, angles, and editing techniques led to such techniques as which one, in which a film alternates between two or more scenes of action, creating an illusion of simultaneity. So one of his techniques then was parallel editing. D.W. Griffith's experiments with shots, angles, and editing techniques led to another one, which is the idea of shots that traveled with the movement of a scene. So that's the idea of tracking shots that he started and we still use today. Well, all the first feature movies were silent movies. In 1925, Warner Brothers was just a small Hollywood studio looking for opportunities to expand, and they introduced the first talkie, and then the more recognized. And so Don Juan was actually released first as a movie with sound, and then The Jazz Singer really gets recognized much more as the first talkie. What years are sometimes known as the golden age of cinema, a time of unparalleled success for the movie industry? That's the period of the late 30s to the early 1940s. And while critics praised E.W. Griffith's early film for its narrative complexity and epic scope, many others were outraged and even started riots at several screenings because of its highly controversial, openly racist attitudes. And of course, that landmark film was The Birth of a Nation. Among the areas of evaluation related to the effects of film on culture, Chapter 8 lists such things as the myths reinforced in films, as well as the social issues in films. Myths of emphasis on individualism, hero myth, standing up to injustice, social issues like excessive consumption, race issues, gun violence, and so forth. True or false, Chapter 8 says, in the current era of globalization, the influence of foreign films remains strong. That is true. In a movie's production budget, part goes toward which of the money on the creative side and which of the money that's on the technical side. So the creative side are the above the line costs, and the technical side then, the people who are behind the camera doing the production are the ones that are classified as the below the line costs. What term has become synonymous with poor production values and ill-conceived sequels, but there are also a number of reasons otherwise why studios might bypass a movie theater for releasing a movie, and that's when we have a movie that goes direct to DVD. For decades, all movies were shot on film, but in 2002, What Movie became the first major Hollywood movie filmed on high-definition digital video instead, starting a trend away from shooting on film, and that was George Lucas's Star Wars Episode II, Attack of the Clones. And as always, these are only highlights, so be sure and read through Chapter 8. Apologies for the typos that show up occasionally, and of course, see the key takeaways at the end of the chapter.